What's up, y'all? It's GC Kinsey, here to share some observations from my personal experience of what it's like to be a political scapegoat as a trans person in the United States. I realized I was trans in 2017, the beginning of Donald Trump's first term as president of the US. And as if the timing of that isn't hilarious enough, the further I've progressed in my transition, the further my country has regressed on trans rights. So I want to talk about what that's been like. A little disclaimer before I get into this, I can only speak from my personal experience. How it feels to be a political scapegoat is going to be different for me as a white trans person than it would be for a black trans person. For me as a trans masc non-binary person than it would be for a binary trans man or woman. For me as a trans person living in the South than it would be for trans people living in other parts of the country. You get the idea. My experiences are not universal by any means, so I highly encourage you to seek out as many varied trans voices from across the board as you can about how this kind of political scapegoating affects all of us. With that said, let's get into it. When I started questioning my gender, I felt generally safe to explore it, and pretty optimistic about my future despite the fact that Trump was in the White House and despite the fact that I was living in the South. It helped a lot that I was no longer living in the small conservative town I'd grown up in, where people pretty much had to stay closeted if they didn't want to get ostracized. Instead, I'd moved to a much more progressive city in my southern state, one where you could be openly queer or trans without drawing too much negative attention. It also helped that I'd surrounded myself with supportive friends, many of whom were queer or trans themselves, and gotten involved in the local cosplay community, which is overall very queer and trans friendly. It helped that I was in a workplace that responded to Trump's trans military ban by immediately expanding their non-discrimination policy to explicitly name gender identity and gender expression as protected. And on a broader scale, it helped that we'd been seeing improvements in the trajectory of queer and trans rights and social acceptance, even in places like my hometown when I would go back and visit. 2017 was just past the 2015 legalization of gay marriage nationwide, and just past what Time magazine had called the transgender tipping point in 2014. The early stages in a massive rise in trans visibility, where suddenly this small minority that had largely flown under the radar was the topic of a lot more conversations around social justice and political activism than ever before. As a result of that, online I was constantly encountering trans stories and trans education, whether I sought that out as part of my own questioning process or whether I just stumbled across it. I was seeing more and more people, even outside of queer-specific spaces, doing things like putting their pronouns in their bios or making their language more trans-inclusive. And in person, my gender exploration was usually met with either support or curiosity. Sometimes there'd be confusion, but not hate or violence. So with my egg freshly shattered, I found all of that very encouraging. I thought, just imagine where we'll be 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Oh, baby GC, if only you knew. I figured there'd be some backlash against this rise in visibility because there always is, but holy fucking shit, I did not think it would be this bad. And maybe that's my own fault for generally having an optimistic personality, but come on. First, there was the explosion of anti-trans legislation, with state governments across the US proposing dozens and then eventually hundreds of bills, basically trying to see how far they could get away with stripping us of our rights and making us second-class citizens. Then there was Project 2025, which was full of not only transphobia, but also racism and misogyny and all other kinds of bigotry, which should have been our collective warning sign, but no, because then there was Donald Trump back in the White House. And one of the very first things he did after taking office was sign an extremely trans, non-binary, and intersex-phobic executive order, basically preventing us from having accurate gender markers on our federal IDs. And it's only gone further and further downhill for us since then at both the state and federal levels. Because it's not just about the bills and laws and executive orders and Supreme Court rulings, it's about the way the Trump administration and the Republican Party more broadly have gone out of their way to make us a target. fear-mongering about us in the media, pressuring schools and hospitals not to support us by threatening to withhold their funding, talking about eradicating us and facing zero consequences for it, using us as their scapegoat. And unfortunately, it's working. It's fanning the flames of the transphobic biases people carry, legitimizing the hate that people feel for us, influencing people who might have otherwise felt neutral about us into seeing us in a negative light, making it less safe for us to exist. So what does it feel like to live through all of that when you're trans? Well, here's what it's like for me. And I'm gonna break it down by comparing the way things used to be in the early days of my transition versus how they are now. Number 1, I'm less open about being trans in public. In the early days, I had no issue being open about it, not just with my friends, but with pretty much any random stranger. I was still closeted in higher stakes situations like at work or with my family, but everywhere else, not even a little bit. I wore my pronouns on my person everywhere I went and pointed them out whenever anyone got them wrong. Whenever I met new people at anime conventions, I would give them what I called the asshole test, which was basically working some mention of being trans into the conversation to see whether or not they would be an asshole about it. That way I wouldn't waste time making friends with someone who was transphobic. Now, I don't feel safe enough to keep moving through the world like that. I'm still open about being trans on social media, like here on YouTube or on my Instagram, because 1, that's my platform and I can filter out trolls whenever I need to, and 2, it's not like someone who hates me on the internet can reach through their screen and punch me in the face. But in person, out in public, the threat of violence is a lot more real now. So my transness has become strictly on a need-to-know basis. I don't wear my pronouns out anymore unless I'm at an anime con or a pride event. I don't talk about being trans unless I'm in a space where I'm 100% certain it won't be an issue. And I absolutely hate that, because being openly and visibly trans has always been important and even gender affirming for me. But I feel like I've had to sacrifice that to protect myself in this political climate. And that leads to number 2. I feel more limited in my gender expression. Because I'm no longer open about being trans in public, I feel a lot of pressure to have a more firmly masculine gender expression instead of the more genderqueer glamdrogynous one I would rather have. I'd already been feeling some of that pressure in recent years for dysphoria reasons, needing to keep my hair shorter or leave off the makeup and nail polish to avoid misgendering, but in this political climate, that pressure is so much stronger because now I feel it for safety reasons. The spaces where I feel safe enough to express my gender with full authenticity are way more restricted. The carefree days from early in my transition when I could go out in public looking like this feel long gone. Now I feel like I've got to keep that locked down to my videos, to private gatherings with friends, maybe to Pride or other queer-friendly events depending on how safe I think I'll be on the drive there and back. Most of the time though, when I'm out in public, I feel like I've got to look like a regular boring-ass dude and I hate it. Number 3, my dysphoria has taken a back seat to safety concerns. This one feels like a natural consequence of points 1 and 2. The less safe I feel being openly trans or having a fully authentic gender expression out in public, the more it feels like my dysphoria is not allowed to matter. By which I mean, in the early days of my transition, whenever I would get misgendered, the number 1 thing that would occupy my mind was dysphoria, was how deeply it hurt to be seen as something I absolutely was not. There were times when I ended up crying in my car or couldn't even bring myself to leave the house because of my dysphoria. And I figured out very quickly that it hurt a lot worse if I just let it slide and didn't say anything. So that's why I started wearing my pronouns everywhere and pointing them out whenever people got them wrong. I had no issue outing myself as trans in those situations because that was what I needed to do to combat my dysphoria. Now, I have to put my safety first. If I get misgendered, I have to make a snap judgment in that moment about how to handle it in the safest way. Sometimes that means speaking up, but trying to react in the way a cis guy would to getting misgendered and not in the way that my queer and trans ass normally would. But other times, it does unfortunately mean letting it slide. On the plus side, my dysphoria isn't really painful anymore. It's more confusing than anything at this point. But it still sucks that now I have to prioritize my safety over my dysphoria in ways I didn't really have to before. I know there are some trans people, particularly visibly trans women, who've never had any choice but to prioritize their safety above all else, and that I was lucky I could do otherwise in the first place. But there still shouldn't be this kind of backsliding now. Number 4, I'm severely anxious about showing ID. I'm in kind of a weird limbo when it comes to legal transition, which I've talked about a lot more extensively in this other video about passports. But in a nutshell, it boils down to this. Instead of legally changing my name, I use my initials, but that means my full name is on all my IDs and therefore reads as a gender mismatch with my appearance. Both my driver's license and my passport still have an F gender marker on them, which also reads as a mismatch with my appearance in a way that an M or even an X marker probably wouldn't. And my passport photo is recent enough to look like me, but my driver's license photo is not. All of that makes me panic inside whenever I have to show my ID to someone. That didn't happen in the early days of my transition, especially before I'd taken any medical steps and therefore my ID didn't out me. But now it absolutely does, and you just never know whether the random stranger you have to show your ID to is going to be okay with trans people, or discreet enough in their reaction to your ID that they don't out you to everyone else within earshot. That's especially scary in a world where all this political scapegoating has made a lot of folks feel more emboldened in their transphobia. Number 5, I'm more reluctant to access healthcare. This one is similar to the ID issue, but with an added layer. Because if you show someone an ID with a matching photo, but a mismatched name and gender marker, then that's only really going to out you as trans if they're paying attention and not just glancing at your picture and birth date. So I can use my passport in most situations and be okay even though it is terrifying. But at healthcare appointments, there's no getting around or hiding my transness. In some situations, it's medically relevant information. In others, it's not, but it's still obvious. Like, I can't pretend I'm just a cis dude taking testosterone for low T when my chest has top surgery scars and my records show a hysterectomy, you know? Being trans isn't always medically relevant, and some people don't come out to their healthcare providers, especially if they think they'll get worse care if they do. That approach is fine if you look enough like a cis person to be stealth, even with your clothes off, but that's also why it doesn't work for me. Before Trump took office for the second time, I went into healthcare appointments feeling reasonably confident that even if a provider or someone on their staff was transphobic, that wasn't going to affect the way they treated me. Their transphobia wouldn't pose a risk to my safety. Now I'm a lot less certain about that, and it makes me hesitant to book any healthcare appointments that aren't absolutely urgent and necessary. I try to do telehealth whenever I can to help combat that, but when I do have to go in person, I am on high alert. I'm not proud to admit this, but I actually had full-blown panic attacks at 2 recent healthcare appointments, one right after the election and another right after the inauguration, when staff members inadvertently outed me to other patients in the waiting room. And I don't know if I will ever get an accurate blood pressure reading at a doctor's office again. So up to now, all of these points have been related to safety, but the last one is a little different, which is number 6. It's harder to feel like this channel is relevant. I started making videos about my transition in 2021, 4 years into social transition and a year before I started medical transition, and I discussed it from a variety of angles, some of them political, but most of them personal. Since Trump's second term began, I found it increasingly harder to justify making videos that are purely personal because they just don't seem that helpful or relevant anymore. And I know that's not true because just based on some of the comments I get, it seems like some of the most helpful videos I make are the ones documenting my singing voice progress on T. That's not an urgent topic in this political climate by any means, but it seems like a lot of y'all are still getting something good out of it. But even so, it's hard not to think, what is the point of posting this right now? Or when I look at my list of video ideas, especially some of the deeply nerdy, gender-affirming language-related stuff that I would love to talk about in the same vein as these videos that felt relevant once upon a time, I keep getting stuck on thoughts like, who cares about these kinds of topics when our community is under attack? It also doesn't help that bad news for the trans community keeps coming out faster than I can keep up with it. Just reading enough news to stay informed is exhausting. Fact-checking the news and deep dive researching into it enough to make videos about it is next to impossible. Especially when my video creation process isn't fast or current. I have to record things in batches and then edit them and post them far ahead of time. Trans people don't really get to opt out of being political because we're so politicized, and that goes double when we're political scapegoats. But it doesn't change the fact that I don't have the qualifications, much less the spoons, to make this a political commentary channel. The reality is, the most value I have to offer by sharing my voice as a trans person is personal, and that's something I've really been struggling with in 2025. To work past it, I actually ended up taking somewhat of a break recently. I kept posting on my usual schedule, but for a few weeks it was all just fun cosplay related stuff, which was the reason I started this channel in the first place, by the way. And doing that actually helped me reset my brain a little bit around feeling irrelevant. It reminded me that even if I can't always bring y'all timely political commentary, one thing I can always bring is trans joy in whatever form that takes. And that's something we need right now more than ever. So, there you have it. That's how I feel as a trans person now that we're such major political scapegoats versus how I felt when I started transitioning. And before I go, I do want to mention one silver lining that's giving me a little bit of hope in the face of all of this. The 2025 US elections. Numerous Democratic candidates had major wins across the US, including many who defeated Republican candidates running anti-trans ads. One of the most exciting victories is Mayor Mamdani in New York City, who ran a very long pro-trans ad, by the way. So do I still think that all this political scapegoating has taken things very far backward for the trans community and overall made us less safe? Yes. Am I still watching my back a lot harder and being much more careful than I was in the early days of my transition? Yes. But this election has made me feel like not all is lost. Like at least we have a chance of defeating this rising tide of transphobia. So on that note, now is where I want to wrap things up and turn the conversation over to you. For my fellow trans and non-binary Americans, how are y'all feeling about being political scapegoats? How are you holding up right now? I would love to hear from you in as many different demographics and as many different regions across the country as possible. For my fellow Americans who are not trans but are still affected by this transphobic BS, like if you're intersex or if you've ever been transvestigated based on how you look, how does this political climate feel for you? For those of you outside the US, what are your thoughts about what's happening here, and how does it compare to transphobia in your country? And for everyone, whether anti-trans scapegoating affects you personally or not, what questions do you have about all this? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I'm GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I've got a lot more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, but like I mentioned earlier, this channel started out as a cosplay channel, so I've got cosplay music videos, cosplay tutorials. I also have a bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone and more, so make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. With that, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all of your support. Stay safe out there, and I will see you on the next one.